developments in player evaluation strategy. Sam Cosentino, Sportsnet's own, is going to be hosting this panel. He knows everything about the CHL, right? Everything?
Nothing.
We'll quiz him after. He agrees. Kevin Abrams is a Canadian in the NFL, the assistant GM for the New York Giants. Brian Burke is on this panel, as too is Dr. Dana Sinclair. She's a licensed psychologist. She consults with individuals in the medical professional, corporate, entertainment, and sports world. In sports, she's worked with the NFL, NHL, NBA, MLB, MLS, IndyCar, as well as Tennis Canada. And Anton Thun is a certified NHLPA agent at Quartexx Management. So Sam, take it away.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thank you so much. Before we get started here, as I always do, and thanks to our sponsors for charging the phones, but I'd like you to turn them off or put them on vibrate or silent, just in case you need that reminder here, because we have an unbelievable panel with amazing experiences in a lot of different fields. I think you're going to find it fascinating. I know for myself this should be a wonderful learning experience as someone who works as a CHL analyst, but I do spend a good chunk of my season working in the NHL draft, which culminates in our draft shows towards the end of the year. This year it'll be June in Montreal. I've gotten the opportunity to work with Brian on the last few of those shows, and it's been pretty interesting and very enlightening, and I would find that this panel would be very much the same. So as we get started here, we're going to jump right into it. We're going to cover a variety of topics, as many as we possibly can. I'd like to open it up for questions afterwards, because I do think there's a lot of value in what this panel has to offer. So we're going to get started right away. Eye test versus analytics. That's the first topic I want to address. And so much in sports has been talked about with the analytics that there's been a bit of a chasm between what we would determine to be the old school, the eye test, the scouts who are out pounding the pavement, watching players and making reports, and the analytics. What do the numbers say about a particular player? And I know in hockey it's been quite an interesting topic. We're still very much old school in that regard in terms of the eye test, but Kevin, I want to start with you. When it comes to evaluating players for the National Football League, where do we stand along that continuum between old school, new school, eye test versus analytics?
Well, the eye test is still the foundation of our player evaluations. That's not going to change. But as time goes by, the analytics becomes a bigger and bigger supporting player in the process. As our ability to gather data gets better and analyze the data, it becomes a tool that is integrated more and more into the evaluation process. It's really just a marrying of conventional wisdom and sort of scientific methodology that what we're trying to do is that the eye test really is how we identify what a player can do, what we think his abilities are, and then we use the analytics and supporting data to sort of identify risk that comes with the player, and we try and remove risk from or players that have risk, they come off our board and we don't consider them, so that's where the analytics comes in.
So we'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of risk and predictive futures of players in terms of injury and so on and so forth. But Brian, I want to address the same question with you. Coming from that hockey world and having been recently involved with the Calgary Flames, where does it stand in hockey along that continuum between old school, new school, analytics, eye test?
Well, for people that have been here before, just so you know Kevin's background, he's highest ranking Canadian in the NFL, but he's talking about player evaluation. He does a lot of player evaluation for the New York Giants and participates in their contract negotiations, so he'll be on the next panel as well. But he's really an expert in this topic. I would echo what Kevin says. To me, and I asked a bunch of millennials this once, and they couldn't answer me. I said, so if you got a leaky wrench, you open the toolbox, what do you grab? A wrench, goddammit. You guys don't even know what a wrench is. It's the same thing. Analytics is the second tool we reach for, actually the third. So we like the eye test. We like it supported by video. The video is not ideal, but it's a good backup tool, and the NFL guys use film for hours and hours and hours. And then the second tool is psychiatric evaluation, which Dr. Sinclair did for me for years. She was our team shrink. And then the third thing is our background check on the player. Aside from Dana's evaluation, we do as much digging as we can on a player. The first 3 rounds is almost like a spider web. We want as many points of contact with this player that we can find. A Bantam coach, a high school teacher, a high school guidance counselor, a next door neighbor. What do the siblings do? So we do a very extensive background check. We want to find what baseball people call makeup. We want to know the character of this person, his work ethic, his tolerance for pain, his ability to get along with other people. And then the last thing is analytics. And we use it more to prove where we're going to be wrong than where we're going to be right. So I'll give you a good example of a player, Erasmus Ristolainen, that plays for the Buffalo Sabres, right? Big right shot defenseman, hard shot, tough, really good player, right? So we were thinking about making a trade for him in Calgary, and we'd actually gone on several phone calls into this trade, and our analytics guy said, you guys are out of your minds. Like, this guy has more turnovers per whatever the analytics were. I didn't pay much attention. But
Old school.
But we didn't do the deal. We didn't do the deal based on the analytics guy. Our guy, Chris Snow is our analytics guy. He's a genius. He says don't do a deal. We don't do a deal. That's how much weight we give him. But that's where the eye test failed, and the player looked better than he was. So to us, it's a key part, as Kevin mentioned. As the analytic data, as it improves, we'll use it more. But right now, it's clearly a third or fourth tool we reach for after the wrench.
You know, Anton, you represent players, and surely you've seen some players that you're sitting there scratching your head saying, well, man, we know this guy, we love this guy.
Absolutely.
Why hasn't he not been picked? Why hasn't he been picked earlier? Where have you seen it change in terms of the eye test and the analytics?
Well, I think Brian answered all those questions in that response because he covered off every topic. But I think the reality of what we're talking about is using data to obtain knowledge, because that's all it is. Data by itself is nothing other than information. It's just pieces of data. And when Sam sent the syllabus here, I looked at the first thing, the eye test and analytics, and you know, here in Toronto we always are looking at reasons why the Leafs fail or the Leafs succeed and so on and so forth, and it's puck possession and it's this and it's that. And I think to Brian's point, in all honesty, when you're assessing hockey players, and you know, Brian's been in management with the NHL for a long time, and I'm an agent, so we're on opposite sides of the table, but I don't think Brian would ever hire a general manager or an assistant general manager or a coach who, when he looked at a hockey player with his eyes, forget about the analytics, couldn't tell Brian, hey, this is a good hockey player or he's a bad hockey player. And at the end of the day, the eye test is something that's been used since I started in the hockey world. When I got in the hockey world 35 years ago, the guys that I went into junior scouts with, and Sam will know this because Sam's done exactly the same thing, were a bunch of these old guys that were 60 years old, and I say 60-year-old old guys, I'm now that guy, okay? And they'd walk in there, and they'd been scouting since the 1940s to the 1950s. They'd walk into a rink with a fedora. All of them had fedoras. And I'd go in there as the young guy, 22, 23, try to assess what's going on. And these guys are making calculations, not with data points. Like today's society, we're making calculations with our computers, okay? They were making calculations with their brains. They were assessing with their eyes the skating ability, the puck handling ability, the defensive strength, the competitiveness, and they never put it down in a computer because computers at that time didn't even exist. So we're actually talking about exactly the same thing. Analytics and eye tests are exactly the same thing. The only difference is the format that you are accumulating that information in. Are you accumulating it in your brain, or are you accumulating on data points in the computer? And to me, the real assessment is, what do you do with that information? What do you do with that knowledge? Okay? And Brian commented that in Calgary, you don't make that decision on Rasmus Ristolainen without Chris Snow, because the eye test didn't work. You know what? I might disagree with you there, because I might suggest to you that it was the person who made the eye test that didn't work in that situation, because that person actually made an assessment just as Chris Snow made an assessment, and you believe that Chris Snow's assessment was the right assessment and the eye test was the wrong assessment. So it wasn't that eye tests are wrong, it was that the person conducting the eye test, his assessment was potentially incorrect.
Possibly, but I also think you can watch a guy skate. I remember going in to watch Milan Lucic in junior. I went in to watch a different player. So our scout said you should go look at Grabner. And by the way, look at this Lucic kid who's playing for Vancouver. And I watched Milan Lucic skate, and he was a terrible skater. And I came back and I said, why'd you guys have me watch this stiff? He's never going to play. And then he turned pro, and you realize, yeah, he's got slow feet, but each stride's taken it. He's like a great blue heron. he's taking slow steps, but he's covering about 8 feet every time. And he gets there just fine. He's had a good career. He's scuffling right now. But I think sometimes the eye test can fail you, even a veteran genius like me.
It can. But to your point, the eye test can fail you and analytics can fail you at the same time. They both can fail you because it comes down to the assessment that you make. And based on your example about Milan Lucic, I think we all would have made a similar assessment because his skating is ugly. Yeah. And it's always been ugly. But the thing that overrode Milan Lucic's ugly skating was two things, I believe. And I think these are perhaps more relevant in a dynamic sport like hockey, because that's what we work in, is the hockey IQ of the player. And I think Milan Lucic, as much as his puck skills and his skating skills are not that good, his hockey IQ is really good. He makes the right decisions at the right time.
Big engine too.
And he's got a big engine, and he loves to compete.
And that's what I want to move along here to Dr. Sinclair, because I really value the opinion. He loves to compete. And I watched Milan play, and I thought all the very same things. But having had a chance to meet him as a young player, I thought, wow, this guy's got that oomph. He's got that something. So I'm going to transition to our next topic now and talk about the psychiatric testing. We've talked a little bit about the old school and the new school, the eye testing versus the analytics. Now we get to a stalemate where one side says yes, the other side says no, and it would be of my opinion that's where you come in, and that's where you might be that decision maker, the one who can sway that decision to look at that player based on what you do and the psychiatric testing that goes along with a player.
Right, well, I deal with, I guess it's behavioral testing really. I mean, psychiatric testing, that's what people talk about, but that really is more diagnostic, clinical type mental health things. So as a performance psychologist, I am really trying to help, in the draft situation anyway, help predict the future play of players by behavior. So I'm looking at whether you want to call it performance style, personality, character, how confident is someone, how competitive are they, do they just not want to lose, do they want to win, what's their self-discipline, how mature are they, can they see and understand other people's points of view, so all of those types of things. And why that's important is because really people are selected based on talent and skill, but they tend to fail because of the behavioral makeup, right? So when I go in and do an assessment, it's a two-step process for me, and again, it's on the behavioral side, not sort of psychiatric. And I don't even know if we're allowed to do psychiatric stuff anymore at combines, actually. Too much of a confidence issue, right? Confidentiality. So. Then what I do is a two-step thing. So I'll have someone fill out something, an online assessment, and then do an interview as well. Both are important. What's most critical for me, it's the eye stuff. It's doing the interview. This year at the NBA Combine, out of 25 interviews, I had 2 players, this was the first, who came into the room, saw the computer, called their agent right away saying, hey, they want me to fill something out. They wouldn't do it. The agent said, nope, forget it, refuse. So I thought, okay, great. Now I've got half an hour instead of 15 minutes to talk to you. So it worked out well for me. So the interview part, being able to see and touch and ask is important, whether it's face-to-face, FaceTime, on the phone. That's what's important on my end.
And again, to put some credibility on this, Dana was how many years did we work together?
18.
15, 18?
Yeah.
So she did all our draft evaluations in Vancouver and Anaheim and Toronto, and found me some pretty good players. A couple of kids named Sedin for one. They worked out okay.
Yeah, you like them.
Yeah. One of the few Swedes I like.
We are going to move it along, and I want to bring it back to you, Kevin, here, because I find this interesting, and I know there's one team that the NHL may not necessarily allow your types, unfortunately, to be involved in the combine.
Oh, yeah. My types are
allowed.
Yep.
Oh, I thought you said that had been
One line of questioning is
The psychiatric.
Psychiatric.
Okay.
Behavioral
so
is fine.
The behavioral and the
Yes.
performance is fine. Okay.
Yeah.
So then I'm going to bring it back to you, Kevin, because I know there's one team, National Hockey League team in particular, that everyone we talk to at the Combine, we get an opportunity to speak to a lot of the players there. And they come in and say, oh man, yeah, this interview was really hard. They had a guy in there who was a former Navy SEAL, and he really challenged me on a certain amount of things. And when it comes to that part, in terms of the mental performance and some of the background stuff, Kevin, how much of a part of your decision making is that?
That's a big part, and it's getting bigger all the time. We sort of, like every club, and we do pretty regular audits of our football operations and our scouting processes, and we kind of felt like over a long period of time, if we looked at our hits and our misses kind of fell in a very common category. There's always some injury ones, and you're going to miss on some players that just didn't develop like you thought they would. But we found most of the guys that were missing because being a professional football player sounds great, but it really isn't for everybody. And you get to the NFL, you stop being the biggest and the fastest kid on the field, and it can be a bit soul crushing. And it's a violent game, and it's just, if you're used to being, it's been easy your whole life, and now it's not easy. And some of these guys just wash out in a hurry, and we're missing on those kinds of guys. And so we've sort of borrowed a line from the Dodgers. We met with them last year to talk about some of their psychological testing, and they always talk about being all in on the neck up. And when we go through our evaluation process, we're doing the same thing now. We don't feel like we've hit entirely on the assessment testing. I'm not sure that there's a silver bullet for that. Danny, you could probably...
There's a best way and a not so good way.
Yeah. But we feel like we have adequate assessment testing, and we use it. It's another data point. And we met last year with the Navy SEALs down in Coronado and talked about their assessment testing. And it rang true once they said it, but it didn't really occur to us until they did. But when they go through, they have a test called the C-SORT they used to use. They don't use it anymore, I don't think. But they found that when they were testing guys for traits that would allow them to make it through SEALs and identify those that would wash out, it was much easier to identify candidates that would not make it than it was to identify candidates that would. And it's really sort of rang true or sounded familiar to our evaluation process, in that we tend to do a better job of identifying the guys that bring an unlikelihood of making it, as opposed to identifying guys who, through makeup, have that extra grit, perseverance, resilience, whatever you want to call it. That's harder to identify, and it's something that people can fake pretty easily too. So anyways, that's a long way of saying we put a lot of value into it.
So, Anton, along those same lines, you represent a player. He might be maybe of questionable character or background. How is it that you go about preparing or helping that player to get over that hurdle?
Well, I'm going to correct your statement, because if a player has questionable character or background, he's never going to be a client of mine. Okay, and I say that because that in and of itself, if he has questionable character, he will never make it to the National Hockey League.
Then how do you go about assessing that?
Too big a headache too.
Well, that too. So
then
how
would you assess that?
Well, I think to a certain extent, we do exactly the same thing that Brian talked about. That in terms of the combine, we talk to people, we talk to their coaches, we talk to scouts that have seen the players play. We listen to the community of people around a player and try to assess the strengths and weaknesses of that player. And to Kevin's point, I think what the SEALs found out is just common sense. At the end of the day, you can look in a room of people and see people with major flaws and know that they're going to fail at something that is as elite as being a Navy SEAL or being a National Hockey League player or an NFL football player. They might be a great high school football player because of the challenges that they have there, or a college player, but when you get to the best of the best, you can't have those flaws in your game. So to me, when I'm looking at an athlete, in addition to their skills, I want to see how confident they are. Because at the end of the day, if you're not confident in yourself, you're never going to be able to achieve that highest level, because you won't get there. The second thing I would suggest is you look at how they self-assess themselves. Because if you can't assess yourself honestly and look at your game and say, I was bad that day or I was good that day, you're never going to be willing to accept the assessment of your coach or general manager who's telling you exactly that same thing, but you disagree every time they're trying to be constructive in terms of the criticism that they're giving to you. And the third thing is the willingness, once you've received that criticism, to actually act on that criticism. If you're willing to accept the criticism, but you're not going to change what you're doing that derives that criticism, then you're going to be exactly the same player you were the day before. You're not going to improve, and you will never get to the top of the mountain, because the 750 guys that play in the NHL are the top of the mountain. The guys in the NFL are the top of the mountain. The top of the mountain is not the NCAA, or it's not high school football, or it's not the American Hockey League. The elite of the elite play in the NHL or the NFL or the NBA, and to be there, you have to be exceptional. Okay, yeah, you can't be run of the mill.
Sorry, Anton. I'm going to repeat or affirm what you said, because not many people in the room might know this, but I practiced law for 6 years before I got into running teams, and I represented players. I had the same rule. If this wasn't a guy I would bring home to have dinner at my table and with my kids, I wouldn't represent him.
Well, let me ask you this
A,
then.
he's not going to get there, and B, he's going to be a lot of headaches.
Let me ask you this, anecdotal, and I don't know if Dr. Dana was working with you at the time, but Trevor Linden is a guy that Kevin brought up and someone that I remember that would be very much along these lines.
Well, I'll tell you the Trevor Linden story. Dana wasn't working for me yet then, so this is 1988. I know, I'm old.
I wasn't born.
Trevor,
So I
You
remember
were,
it.
yeah, exactly.
so Trevor Linden was played for the Medicine Hat Tigers, so that was the Mike Modano draft. If you need a perspective, he went first overall. We had the second pick in the draft. And so we brought in 7 guys. Curtis Lecision was one of them. We brought him in for a battery of psychological and physical tests. So strength coach put him through a bunch of tests on the bike and the bench press. And then this our sports psychologist administered a written test and then interviewed them. So Trevor was supposed to come in on Saturday morning. And he called me Thursday night. He said, Mr. Burke, it's Trevor Linden. My dad said I had to call you. I can't come on Saturday. I said, well, Trev, none of the players call me Mr. Burke. Everyone calls me Berkey, so why can't you come? He said, well, my dad said I had to call you. I can't come. I said, I got that part. Your dad made you call and you can't come. Why can't you come? And he said, well, my uncle has a cattle ranch here in the Hatton. It's branding day, and my dad says I have to stay and help. So I'm like, well, what's your job? He says, well, when the calves come into the pen, I hold them down and while we brand them, and then we turn the male calves into steers by cutting their nuts off. So I was like, kid, you can skip these tests. Like for us, it's not that holding a calf down is that hard for a big athlete, right? They're not that big. It was the family values involved that, yes, you have a chance to be a millionaire, but you'll do it on your own time. Saturday, you got to help your uncle. We drafted him. He ended up being a captain of 4 different NHL teams. Great kid. And then became a GM briefly.
You know, Dr. Sinclair, not that we're administering those types of tests these days, thank goodness. But where have you seen advancements in what you do in terms of evaluating a player and being a little bit more predictive in what you would value as a player you'd want to be on your team as opposed to one that some like the Navy SEALs you don't want?
Well, I think that's the point I did want to make, is go back to the red flags. And I think it is most important to avoid those people you don't want in your organization who won't be able to get to their skill set under pressure. Those red flags that are impulsive, that are going to get into trouble on and off the field. So it's really important to avoid those kind of guys because they become toxic. That, I think, is probably the best thing that you can do for your risk management system.
If I can just add to that, I think we have a tendency in life to want to be the good Samaritan and want to save somebody from themselves. And I've been an agent for 35 years, and probably the first 10 years when I was trying to build the business, I took on clients that I would never take on today because you believe in yourself and you believe that you can save them from themselves. And you realize very quickly that no matter what you're going to do, you can't save them. And all they do is bring you down and destroy your life, and they become, to use your word, toxic.
Yes.
You've got to discard them.
Many examples.
And the worst kind of guys are guys that drag people down with them. You can tolerate a guy who's a loser, and a lot of it's how strong your room is, right? So Dana will say to me, look, this kid, I got 2 red flags on this kid, but I'm not going to take him off the list because we got enough in the room to bend this kid. You never totally reshape a kid. Leopard's not going to change its spots, but you can bend a kid. You can cure some of his habits if they're not too severe or too ingrained. And so we talk about the strength of our room. And like when I first got here to Toronto, we had nothing in the room. There's no way I was going to take any chance on anybody. But by the time I got fired, I felt good about the room enough that part of the reason we made the Phil Kessel deal is we felt we could push Phil a little bit. He'd come in and he'd feel the push of playing in Canada and the strength we had in our room. We had Dion Phaneuf in the room. So a lot of it's the room you have. And sometimes you just gamble, like Fedorov. You know, we had Tampa Bay Lightning drafted Fedor Fedorov, which is Sergei's little brother, only he's not little. He's 6'4", 230. And he was a high pick with Tampa, and they didn't sign him. He washed out with them, went back in the draft, and we took him. And our scouts, I went and told the owner, I said, look, we are rolling dice here. Like, Dana hated him. But we're like,
He was nice.
we got him in the third. We got him in the 3rd round, and we're like, okay, this 6'4", 230. We weren't big enough. He's talented. He's actually a good kid.
Yeah.
Just uncoachable. Just could not conform to instructions. Couldn't follow direction. Couldn't take criticism. But if he came up here and talked now, you guys would love him. Polite, handsome, wonderful kid. Just a terrible hockey player. So we said to the owner, look, we're rolling the dice here. This kid's either going to be a star or he's never going to play. There's not going to be any gray on this kid. He's either going to be a home run or it's going to be a strikeout. And it was a strikeout. But he helped us find Kevin Bieksa. So Kevin Bieksa, who was a draft pick that played at Bowling Green, graduated. I wasn't sure if I wanted to sign him, so I made him go into Manitoba, which was our farm team in Winnipeg, on an ATO, on an amateur trout agreement. First night he's there, he doesn't dress, and he gets in a fight with Fedorov in the parking lot outside of Earl's after the game. So what happened was he threw like a little drink straw onto the table, and Federer says, we're going outside. So Kevin Bieksa says, he's out of a trout agreement. He can't get in a fight with a teammate, right? So he says to Dallas Eakins, who was our captain, who's now coach of the Anaheim Ducks, he wants me to go outside and fight him. And Dallas says, well, go outside and kick his ass. He said, they're going to send me home tomorrow. He said, you don't know our boss. You go out and kick his ass and come back in. So Dallas never even got up from the bar. He didn't even go out and watch the fight. He just sat at the bar and drank his red wine. Bieksa hits him once, cuts him wide open, knocks him cold. He comes back in. And he said, a much bigger man. Bieksa's only about 190 pounds, and Federer was huge. He comes back in. He said, they're going to send me home tomorrow. He said, nope, they're going to sign you tomorrow. And we did. We signed him the next day. So Fedorov indirectly got us Kevin Bieksa.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the mental performance side, about the eye test, the analytics. Where we've seen quite an increase and quite a change in things is exercise and sports science. And I use my personal experience going to the NHL Combine. When I first started to go, I was in a big room at a convention center out by the airport, and a bunch of people would be standing around, everyone would be talking and chatting and so on and so forth. Now you go to the Combine, it's in Buffalo, it's at the Harbour Center, and it's essentially set up with a row of desks, about as long as the boards are, the sideboards, where all these buffed up, pumped up dudes are sitting there, and they're assessing the exercise and sports science things. And if you've seen the Combine, all the tests that they do, there's been a lot of changes even in that in and of itself. And so that's the area I want to address now, starting with you, Kevin. Talk about exercise and sports science and how much more we know about that and how it can be used as a predictor for future success.
Yeah, I think the fact that we've got new information that we didn't used to have because of new technologies that we're able to do more from an evaluative point of view with respect to the players' physical traits. We still do all the same testing we've always done at the Combine, and it's useful, but the players are able to prepare for it so much that it's not quite a genuine indicator of what their physical capabilities are. But where we've seen real gains recently is that we have so much more data on players' injury history that we're able to model injury probabilities for players. And it's not perfect. It's getting better all the time as the population of data gets bigger and bigger. So it gives us a good idea of what kind of risk we're taking on with a player. I mean, I feel like every category we talk about, I'm talking about risk, but that's really the biggest part of the evaluation process is we're trying to make a very probabilistic model with respect to everything that you can measure, and we want to quantify as many things as we can so that we can make the best and most informed football decisions.
So Anton, to that end, and some of the players that you talk about and represent, you're getting them ready for the NHL Combine. It's a big thing. Everybody's going to be there. How is it that you can prepare your players in that regard? And what tools do you use in terms of exercise and sports science to make your players more available to hopefully predict what you might think would make them more successful?
Sure. Listen, I think at the end of the day, there's two aspects. If I can just comment, I think there's two aspects to the sports science that have really evolved since I've been involved in sports. And one is the aspect that Kevin just talked about, and when you're at a combines, whether it be the NFL or the NHL, and you're doing the testing, and you've got some very extremely competent and sometimes brilliant people in that room who are trying to assess individual athletes at the age of 18, so it's a little bit different than in football because it's younger, who are coming from a variety of different backgrounds, who some have trained with Gary Roberts in his facility at St. Andrews for 4 years during the summer and are buffed and pumped up and have had the ability to do power skating and skills training and workouts with the best trainers possible in Gary or Matt Nichols here in Toronto or others. And then you've got the kid coming from Timmins, Ontario, who goes to the Good Life Fitness an hour a day and tries to pump iron and hasn't got all those benefits. And I think that's where the true magic of this sports science comes in, because if you're the trainer for or the strength and conditioning guy for the Toronto Maple Leafs, you're not just assessing guys who've all come out of college football, who've played at Ohio State or whatever and had the best gyms and facilities for 4 years. You're assessing a bunch of guys that one has the best of facilities and the other has the weakest of facilities, and one guy can't bench press 120 pounds and the other guy is doing 240 pounds 20 times in his sleep. And I'm not quite sure, I don't want to pretend to know the answers, but the people that are predicting the success of these guys across that spectrum are geniuses. And it's an art form, I think, as much as it is a science in a lot of ways. And to that extent as well, we have players who have different body types. And Trevor Linden, you would never look at Trevor Linden with his body type because he's long and he's lean and you know, to me, he has what in the old school we'd say he's got farmer strength, okay? He's not muscle bound. He's a runner. He's a bike guy. He's like Dallas Eakins, right? They're not big guys. You know, you look at George McPhee, who's the general manager of the Vegas Knights, and you realize he was a tough guy when he was a player. Yeah. And you look at George, and he's a midget compared to the people on this panel. It's ridiculous. But even a midget compared to Dana. And so at the end of the day, it truly becomes not only a science but an art form. But the other aspect of the science that's really developing is the assessment part, even for injuries. And I think that's really accelerated down the path. And you're at the combines, I think you're trying to assess a player in terms of, you know, what his injury history is and is he likely to blow out his knee again and so on and so forth. But when I start reading some of the articles, you know, in the Toronto Daily newspapers and we're doing load management for Kawhi Leonard and we're doing load management for Sebastian Giovinco, not because Sebastian Giovinco was hurt, but because the doctors for the Toronto FC Soccer Club would predict that if he continued to play 2 games in every 3 days, that the wear and tear on his muscles was going to blow out his left knee. To me, that's crazy, but that's where we're getting in terms of sports science, and I think it only helps these athletes.
How much, Dr. Dana Sinclair, are you privy to when it comes to the exercise and sports science, the predictive injury things, when you go in to make an assessment in terms of the mental performance, are you privy to that information? Do you find it helpful at all, knowing what you might find out as another layer in your assessments?
Actually, not necessarily. I go strictly with the behavioral side of things.
It's the team doctors more so.
Yeah, yeah. So
it's going to get better, but the fact of the matter is we've seen very little correlation with, you draft a guy who's had knee surgery, he's probably going to hurt that knee again. You can brace it. The problems for us where we've seen the biggest risk for us are guys who are, we call medical textbooks. They have a variety of different injuries. It's not one thing. So he blows his shoulder one year, next year it's his knee, next year he breaks his leg, and all of a sudden you're like, God, what's going to happen next to this kid? So we look at the injury, the doctor looks at him. Most of these kids don't get to their draft year without one surgery, without having one shoulder done or one knee done at some point. So the doctor, range of motion, strength, all that stuff. When they repair a shoulder surgically, if the rehab's done properly, it's just as functional and as strong as it was before the surgery. It's not like the player has a deficit there if the rehab's done properly. So it doesn't mean that shoulder's going to go again. It's more likely than the other one, but we're in a full contact sport. We're going to draft people that are going to get hurt whether we use computers or not.
Well, let me ask you this then, because I'm sure the 3 of you and the 4 of you, when I extend that out to you, Dr. Sinclair, have had players where you're saying, oh my gosh, he's hurt again. Like, what's he doing in the trainer's room? Why is he always in there? That sort of thing. Is that something through your assessments that you're able to say, hey, we're a little bit concerned about his character, that if he's not at 100%, he doesn't want to go to the post, she doesn't want to go to the post, he or she doesn't want to play or perform in that particular sport. Is that something that you're able to assess?
Yeah, you can get a handle on that.
And
You can determine if someone is more prone to anxiety and depression and how they're going to recover after an injury or a long, hard injury. Are they going to be able to bounce back quickly or not? Is it going to, and if they have more troubles than that, is it going to cascade?
is the term "it's in your head"? Does that apply? Does that play here?
Well, can I comment on that?
Please do.
I think it does happen.
I've seen it in baseball, so
I think it
that's why I
does
say
happen,
that. I've
and
seen
the
it.
reason why I say that is, going back to the point that I made before, when you're in the National Hockey League or the NFL, you can't have questions in your head when you're going out on the field.
They do all the
okay?
time.
Well, they do,
Do all
but
the
you have to
time.
limit the number. And if you're hearing white noise when you hop off the bench, okay, and you're not properly assessing what's going on out there, the nature of hockey, the nature of football, it's a contact sport. And if you're not focused 100% on what's going on when you're out there, you're risking injury, severe injury, because somebody is going to hurt you.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, I don't know if it's the same with the NFL. Our players will happily, with a smile on their face, lie to the team doctor or the trainer to get to play. Like we've had players on the SCAT-2 concussion protocol test. They know they're going to have to take that in a quiet room in a rink somewhere to get their bell rung. So when they do it the first time, they'll take longer than they need to complete it. So if they take an extra 30 seconds, they got 30 seconds more in the quiet room. We've begged them not to do it. We've told them, do this test as honestly and as quickly, as fairly as you can, but we know they still do it. They will lie to the trainer. The trainer say, you good to go? Yep, good to go. That's why we had to put in spotters. Everyone thinks it's because the team rushed people, like these people back. It's because the players would lie to the trainer. I did it. Everyone did it.
Is that sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, Brian. Has that ever, Kevin, been an issue for you, where you're looking at someone and you're saying, "Wow, this is a bit of a red flag here. He was hurt a lot in college, or since he's been with us, our guys are saying, from a physical perspective, there's nothing wrong with him here. Yet he doesn't want to play, doesn't want to perform." Has that ever happened to you? Have you seen that in players before, and how much does that impact what you're doing with your roster and in terms of player procurement, if you've heard that about another player that you're looking at?
Well, I think that similar to what Brian said, we have more players that would be dishonest about an injury to get back on the field or not be pulled from a game than we do players that would exaggerate injuries or be reluctant to return to play. So it's very similar in NFL and NHL. As far as guys that have long injury histories, some guys just are, and girls are just made of bad protoplasm. They get hurt more often. It's not everybody's the same, and some guys and girls would have their spatial awareness relative to the sport they're playing isn't equal for everybody, and some people just put their bodies in bad positions, and in a violent sport that can lead to more injuries as well. So there's a lot of contributing factors.
The only reason they say that, I worked in baseball for a long time, and I can remember seeing guys, and the players around them in the room would say, "Well, there's nothing wrong with him. He's on the table every day. Like, what's going on with this guy?" And he goes out there and he'll throw a bullpen, and everything's working. The curveball's working, the fastball's working, and there's nothing in there that says that this guy should be on the injured list.
I've had guys that won't go unless they won't 100%.
Right.
Like, in other words, they're not lying to us that they're hurt, but they don't feel they're 100%. The average hockey player will gladly go at 85%. Gladly go and take a shot to do it. Take a shot of Novocaine in a hip pointer, or take a shot of Novocaine somewhere where he's able to play at 85%, especially in the playoffs. These guys are Vikings in the playoffs.
And I've seen it in baseball too. Don't get me wrong.
But
That side of it works on that side
I
of the
have
fence
had
as
the
well.
odd guy who says, "I'm not going," especially with concussions. We don't want them to go till they're convinced they're 100% anyway. But I've had guys where the doctor says, "Look, he's asymptomatic. He's cleared for contact," and the player says, "I know I'm cleared for contact, but it's like Anton said, if he's worried a little bit about getting hit, he's no good to me anyway."
Well, if I can just add to that, because I had a client many, many years ago, and he was actually with the Vancouver Canucks, but I don't think Brian was the GM at the time, who had a concussion, and he sustained it at the end of the prior season. Didn't have a lot of symptoms when he went to train harder, because I don't think he trained that hard in the off season at that point in time. In August to prepare for camp, he started getting the symptoms. went to training camp. They diagnosed him with concussion-like symptoms or concussion symptoms. And I got a phone call, actually it was from Dave Nonis, that season in December because he hadn't played yet, okay? And Dave said, Anton, I don't know how to bring this up to you, but our doctors tell us that there's nothing wrong with him. Okay, it's the fall season here, and people have flus and headaches and stuff like that. Just the general malaise of what an early winter is in Vancouver, and he's your client's attributing everything that's wrong with him, a sniffle, to the concussion that he had, and it's all going back to the concussion. Our doctors all tell us that he's fine. And so what I ended up doing was I flew out to Vancouver, I met with my client, had a conversation with him to get his perspective. I met with a doctor that he was meeting, a chiropractor that a lot of the players on the team were meeting to deal with some of their neck and concussion issues. Brian probably knows who it is. And I asked him, I said, do you see any symptoms? He says, no. He's been symptom-free for 2 months, okay? He's just so overly sensitive because it's a brain injury rather than a knee injury or an elbow injury. And he got married last summer and he is thinking of starting a family. He's afraid to get back on the ice. And so I sat down with him just before Christmas, before the Christmas break, and I said, listen, I won't mention the name. At some point in time, you have to make a decision as a professional athlete to either get back on the horse or to retire. If every symptom that you have the rest of your life, you're going to attribute back to the injury you sustained last March, you're never going to be able to be a professional athlete. And to his credit, everybody gave him the same advice. Dave Nonis gave him the same advice. The coaching staff, the doctors all gave him the same advice. And he got back on the horse in January. And he played again. But he had to overcome that fear of long-term permanent injury in his personal circumstances, having just gotten married, wanting to have children. And so I think the reaction for some of these athletes when it comes to assessing what can be a permanent injury, rather, like to me a knee injury can be permanent, but it's repairable. An elbow injury, a shoulder injury, all that stuff is repairable. It's mechanical. Your brain is screwing up your hard drive. And athletes today, because of the publicity of what's taken place, are that much more sensitive to that. To Brian and Kevin's point, the athletes that I meet typically will go through a wall to come back to play. They will lie on a diagnostic test if they want to play in a game to get back in the game. But there is a generation of athletes today that have been brought up in the concussion world that are a little bit more sensitive to the damage that can cause.
When I was playing college hockey, if you got a concussion and you're lying on the ice, the first thing you did was look at the scoreboard, because the trainer's going to ask you what the score is. You got to know what period it is and what the score is. So you're lying on the ice, it's foggy, but the first thing you do is get the score and get the period, because he's going to ask you, who are we playing? What's the score? What period?
And get the smelling salts.
So now you've talked your way into possibly returning to play. That's how primitive it was then. And no spotters.
Ryan, I just want to leave it there because we're running short on time here. And I want to bring this conversation back about the injuries and the predictive things back to what we're talking about, developments in player evaluation. So we've talked about analytics, we've talked about exercise and sports science, we've talked about mental performance, we've talked about the eye test. I think the bottom line is all of those things are applicable, and the more data we can gather on a player, the better off in general we're going to be in predicting the success of that player. A very quick answer from each of the panelists here, because this has I have a particular liking to this question. Media influence in terms of how we draft, when that player is drafted, when that player gets into our lineup, when he deserves to be up in the lineup. Does the media have any influence at all? Dr. Sinclair, have you ever seen that or noticed that for a general manager that's saying, oh, we got to get this kid in the lineup, or have you ever seen that before?
Of course, all the time.
So you do think that the media can have an influence?
I think that they can have an influence. Doesn't mean that they're going to make a decision based on that, but it's a distraction sometimes.
Anton?
I think they can. I think they do in certain marketplaces. Should they? Absolutely not. Zero.
Brian, you've worked in a lot of markets, in Canadian markets where the pressure in hockey is large. Have you ever been impacted by that?
Zero impact.
Kevin?
Zero.
In a large market like that, it's never a consideration.
Never.
Awesome. If you're going to let someone who, like me, tell you who should play for your team, you're going to be out of work soon.
No, I'm not saying that that's the case, but I'm saying, hey, there's your first round pick. Where is this guy? We haven't seen him. Why isn't he in the lineup? That has no impact on what you did and when you promoted a player or moved him.
No, if I'm going to get fired, I'm going to get fired without you.
Perfect. Thank you very much to our panelists. Before we leave, though, I want to open it up to questions here because we have a wealth of experience here, and I think it's very valuable. Are there any questions? Please step to the mic. Let us know who you are and your question, please.
Hi, Catherine McLeod again. So this may be more applicable to Dr. Sinclair. With behavioral science, it also sometimes includes those behaviors that come with fear, say from a concussion, or even fear of the stigma associated with antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, and coping with that. A person, at least from my understanding, can have all the beneficial personality traits that you may look for, but then because they have that history or fighting with that currently, that can clutter the decision making. So is that something that is considered within the field now as, well, it's obviously a factor, but a yes or no factor?
You mean you're talking mental health versus performance?
Well, how it would affect behavior, yes.
What would affect behavior?
So, for example, say a person has depression
Yeah.
and they're managing it,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, they'll have that talking in their head that some coaches, agents may not want when they're stepping onto the field, such as white noise, but yet they can be amazing. They can have that perseverance. Is that always shown when you do your behavioral testing? Like,
You can get a pretty good idea of where they are in terms of anxiety and depression, for sure. But the thing is, no matter what you think about professional athletes, and so many of them have those regular fears, fear of failure, things that derail them, that distract them. They worry about their confidence, they worry about getting tense. So those are all sort of in the normal bucket. It just depends whether they're sort of subclinical normal or they get over the line into the clinical zone. But you can still perform great if you're managing the things that can derail you, for sure. That's why we haven't even talked about it, but that's why development is so important, because you can take any personality and make that person better or help them improve, for sure.
Amazing question, and it does speak to what we're talking about here, the developments in player evaluation, and I think that's a very important point because that stigma sometimes is attached with the player that he's not touchable, he's untouchable, he's a non-draft, whatever the case may be, and that does happen. I've experienced that and talked to general managers and head scouts who put people in that regard very much in that box and will not be associated with that person. Next question.
And we are very sensitive to signs of mental illness on our teams. We never were. We didn't know. We were really uninformed and ignorant. But now the trainers, teammates, if a guy sees your teammate's down, the guy next to you say something to the trainer, like you see something, say something. We're much more attuned to mental illness on our teams, and I say teams because we all have a farm team too, than we were.
Next question, please.
Hi, Will Zanyuk from Niagara College. Brian, I have a question. Being a big Canucks fan and being born after 2000, I didn't get to see the Scenes get drafted, but I did read about it online, and from what I've read, you weren't too high on the Scene Twins after watching them in the World Junior, but you had a scout that said otherwise. Considering it's 2 picks in the top 3 of the draft, what made you choose to trust that scout, and what did you actually end up seeing in the Scene Twins to make that big risk that ended up being a pretty big success?
The answer would take about 7 minutes, and we don't have 7 minutes, but I'll tell you the short answer. They played in the World Juniors of that year in Winnipeg, their draft year, and they were horseshit. They came in, I think they finished 2nd and 3rd in scoring, but they got all their points against Albania and Bulgaria and Israel, and against Canada and the U.S., they got their asses kicked. So I told our scouts I'm trading the pick, which you hate doing. The scouts work all year for one day, and you're going to trade a high pick? You might as well shoot the guy's dog, right, as trade the pick. And so at the end of the season, Thomas Green was our scout. He believed in these kids right from the get-go. And I said, Thomas, I'm trading the pick. He says, you got to get them both. I'm like, what are you talking about? How am I going to get them both? So that year, the World Championships were in it was Norway. And they announced the team, and the Sedins were on it. And Thomas Green called me, and I used to get in at 6 in the morning. He called me from Sweden. He said, do you see the team Sweden? I said, yeah, who's hurt? Obviously, if they're taking the Twins, somebody's hurt. No one takes 18-year-olds to that tournament. Like Capo Caco played this year. It was a huge deal. An 18-year-old played in the men's tournament. So I went over and watched him play 3 times. And that was the first time you could see this crazy twin shit that they did, right? like it was so obvious. And that's when I decided I had to have them and I ended up making the deals. But the 2 guys that deserve credit for the Twins are Thomas Gradin and Mark Crawford, because Mark Crawford turned them into players.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take the last question, then I'll have one more comment before this panel comes to a close. Next question.
Okay, thanks. Dom Gurton from PrimeTime Sports. Could you guys talk about the differences between scouting and drafting in the NFL, where it's in the early 20s versus the NHL, where it's 16 to 18 years old, both behaviorally and physically, when it comes to being ready and succeeding in the league?
I think the quick question would be, are we more predictive the older we are?
I did this survey a couple years ago. I talked to you about this. The NFL doesn't do a much better job with 22 and 23-year-olds than we do. It's like a 20% margin better, I think. Right.
It makes no difference to me in the behavioral side.
Yeah, we looked very closely at it years ago. So I went to training camp with Kevin with the Giants. We're always trying to get better, right? Went to training camp with the Colts. Went in and studied everything the Colts did. Did a full exchange, front office exchange with the Saints. We don't want to be best in show, or best in breed, just the best in the NHL. We want to be best in pro sports. We steal ideas from anyone. So Kevin and I actually talked about this at training camp. I said, how come you're drafting 23-year-olds if they're redshirt freshmen, and I'm drafting 18-year-olds, and you guys, not you, the NFL doesn't do a whole lot better than we do. It's about a 15% bump. But they miss as much as we do almost. It's crazy. But you're betting on 18-year-olds. Like even now, we view a successful pick as a guy that plays 225 games. So that's 3 full seasons, all right, 246 games, less time for injury. So 225. It's only about a third to 40% of teams that get 240 or 225 games out of their first-round pick. Crazy.
Yeah, I find it amazing. And I heard a stat recently on the road by one of the NHL teams that said second-round picks to play 100 games, 22%. Think about that.
20%. And to play 220, about 15%.
I mean,
we don't do a very good job of it. We'd like to move the draft age up, but the union's not going to go for that.
But as Dr. Sinclair said, it's not going to matter. Not from your perspective.
Nope.
So age has no impact.
Well, once they get to around 18, it's pretty solid. And from my zone, I'm quite confident at what report I would put out.
Amazing.
18 or 22, doesn't matter.
In hockey, though, you get to see 2 seasons of 68 games if they're coming out of major junior, so 176 games. Kevin's maybe seeing seniors coming out of the NCAA who might have played 40 games tops. To what degree does that make a difference?
Well, we see them practice too, which is a good indicator for us if we can get to the college campuses. More so than from a makeup point of view, the physical development obviously is a big difference. And we always talk about it when we speak to our counterparts in hockey and baseball that it boggles our mind that they're trying to evaluate 18-year-olds in different countries who have different languages that they've got to, they've got to learn a new language when they get here. You're trying to evaluate a baseball player using an aluminum bat in the hills of the Dominican against 60-mile-an-hour fastballs and trying to project what's he going to be at 22 years old, trying to hit a Clayton Kershaw fastball. I mean, that's
with a wooden bat.
With a wooden bat. I mean, it's staggering to me. So, we struggle more so with finding good levels of competition so we can evaluate them against what look like NFL prospects. But if you're trying to evaluate a player who's playing against, Holy Cross, it's going to be a little more difficult than trying to evaluate a player playing in the SEC.
Fantastic. Can I just add something to that? I think part of the dilemma as well, perhaps in football in contrast to hockey, is you're right. Hockey junior teams, your team in London's playing 68 games, plus the playoffs. You're actually probably playing 80 or 90 or 100 games if you're successful. And
90 if you go to Memorial Cup.
Exactly. And in Kevin's case, it's probably a 12-game season for college players.
And that's about 14 or 15.
And that, yeah. And so, but from what I've seen, and I don't follow college football that much, oftentimes that elite athlete isn't even getting to be the starter in his program if it's an elite program until he's a junior or a senior. So he's a guy that as a sophomore or as a junior has been sitting as the 4th string left tackle, and you're not even evaluating him for the most part until you get to a senior. So the number of eyeballs that you've got on him are that much less.
But they use film a lot more than we do too.
They do a lot of film? Okay.
We have 1 minute left here. It's one or the other. I'm going to ask the 4 of you on the panel here. One or the other. Unfortunately, we don't have time to expand. This is a topic I wanted to address, but because we're limited by time, the question is, which is more important, drafting or development? We'll start with you, Dr. Sinclair. One word answer, drafting or development?
Development. Nope, drafting.
Got it in. I got it in.
You can't do that. Anton.
I'll say drafting because I don't think you can develop a player that has no talent.
I'll say both.
See?
No, I need you to pick one. You're in the media now. You can
Development.
Development? Excellent. Kevin?
Drafting, but just barely.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank the panelists so much. Like I said, a wealth of unbelievable worldly experience from this group. Simply amazing and an honor for me to be here, first time in a long time, because normally I'm working during the conference. So I hope that I'm invited every year. No, I'm invited every year. So I want to say thanks to PrimeTime for having me. I want to thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for being here and sharing their knowledge. Thank you so much.